I started going back and trying to find the pictures of the old Capitol. And what I found is it doesn't make sense in any timeline. Some pictures earlier have a dome when they say it hadn't been built yet. Other pictures later have no dome. There's two different Washington monuments. There's a shorter one with a base around it that's a building, and then there's a tall one. Now, wait a minute. How could that be? This is where we get into the whole, what is our timeline? What is the issue with these old buildings? We call them Victorian, but they're obviously not. They're all Romanesque. They've got these domes, and they're much older than what we're being told. If you're a biblical scholar, you might know that area of the world because of the Pergamon altar, which was the seat of Satan. And it was unearthed in the 1800s, and it was rebuilt in Berlin, full-size model. This is the old friezes they put, and that was used as the model for the Nuremberg trials. And if you want to get even creepier, in 2008, Barack Obama went over to Berlin and visited the Pergamon altar in the museum. And afterwards, I remember sitting with a friend of mine and looking at the DNC convention when he was nominated for running for president the first time. And I remember saying to her, "Don't you think that's a weird looking backdrop? What is that kind of Romanesque looking background?" Well, you can see it. It's the Pergamon altar. And when you look at the ruling class of any country, the big shots of any profession, they're all these people. They may go by different names, but here's an example. If you want to know why Tom Cruise doesn't age and why he could get married in the Castillo dei Orsini, is because he is an Orsini. And the Orsini clan are the senior black nobility of Italy. Pepe Orsini is the head of it, and he is a direct descendant of Julius Caesar. So again, when Rome fell, they didn't go away, right? They just took off their togas, put on banker suits, and became these business people.
My guest today is Dr. Lee Merritt. She is known as the Medical Rebel. She graduated from the University of Rochester School of Medicine and Dentistry in New York and served over 10 years as a Navy physician and surgeon. She became a medical rebel after realizing that the honorable practice of medicine had been hijacked to serve enslavement rather than wellness. So welcome, Dr. Merritt. I appreciate you coming on to speak with us today.
No, thanks so much for having me. Yeah. And I love GSIC. That was a great meeting. We met back there. Yeah, that was wonderful.
That's right. It was a lot of fun. Oh, absolutely. I mean, there were so many great presentations, and you were one of them. And as I was just telling you before we started recording, your presentation was probably one of the most eye-opening for me. And you covered so many topics, and I'm excited to talk with you about them today. I know we're going to cover some of those today, but I was thinking people need to hear this. I mean, this is information that people need to start learning more about. So I'm excited to have you show this to us today. I know you have a little presentation we're going to walk through, but before we do that, I know a lot of people, the first question they're going to ask is, what is the moniker of Medical Rebel? Where does that come from? Well, yeah, so I think it's interesting if you can share with us about that.
Sure. Even before COVID, I guess I was a little bit of a medical rebel. I was in private solo practice of orthopedic spine surgery. And I did that, ultimately I was in practice over 35 years total. But what happened was, about early on, I realized just things weren't right, that we were being lied to about so many different things that we actually knew were true. I mean, for example, I used to tell people every day in my orthopedic clinic, I would say, you need to be on 10,000 international units of vitamin D a day. Now, and I still believe that, but there's some modifications. I mean, there's some issues there that we could talk about, but generally that's a good recommendation, because if you don't live naked on the equator, you just don't get enough vitamin D. And I was taking care of all these women whose spines were collapsing. Okay. And I said, wow, we've got to, and what they were pushing, the medicines they were pushing, weren't really doing what they were saying they were doing. And they were still talking. I mean, this is the Institute of Medicine is still talking about, oh, that just makes expensive urine, all these vitamins. You just need 400 units of vitamin D a day. You get that in milk or whatever. And that's just it's provably not true. So, and then when COVID hit, we doubled down on that. They told us all these bad things. So I had been the other third thing is, after being in the military, when I was in private spine practice, when I first got out of my fellowship, I was in the biggest group in the Washington, D.C. area. And my husband at the time was a Marine Corps colonel. He was at the Pentagon, and he said, oh, there's the Navy Research Advisory Committee is looking for a doctor, and it's a subcommittee of the Congress. So I got appointed to this. And it turns out what they do is look at future technology for the Navy. So I was sitting in this, literally a locked vault sometimes with the captains of the military industrial complex. And I didn't have a lot to talk about because they had a physician there just in case these questions came up, but I wasn't used that much. And I thought, well, since I don't know much about kilo class submarines, I think I'll research bio and chemical. These are something I didn't know much about. I knew about the atomic part, but I didn't know those two. So I went down this road and I got to know what was going on in the community. Now, about that time, and this is going to get to COVID and the big scam, about that time was the time that we bought, under the Nunn-Lugar Act that was passed in the middle of the night, we bought up all the old bio labs surrounding the Soviet Union as it was collapsing. In 91, 92, that was when the whole thing was falling apart. And we went over under the guise of threat reduction. If you hear threat reduction, it's really not. That's a bio program or some other kind of program. So they went over and they bought up all those labs. So now I'm hearing, Congress is, first of all, this I read Russian. So when this disease came out, this so-called COVID, I started reading, it wasn't making sense to me. So in January of 2020, I started reading the Russian guys, and I found some bio guys that were saying, no, we don't think this is natural. We think this is a bio, and it didn't, and we don't think the Chinese created it. Now that doesn't mean it didn't start there. He said we don't think the Chinese created it. Well, that was a big wake up, because I just didn't think we were being honest about it. So that's how I got into it. And I then got cancel cultured because I had the actual temerity to try and stop the mask mandate in Omaha, Nebraska. And it was amazing what happened. It was amazing. I mean, I had a little office there. I was semi-retired at this point. I just had a little office over there, but I was doing an orthopedic contract 90 miles away, the other side of my house, and I went down to just suggest that this is nonsense. Nobody believes in masks at this point, and it's not like OSHA just showed up yesterday, and the environmental sciences guys, they know about how masks work, and they don't work for this. So anyway, I went down there. The only people down there, against the mask were me and Ben Tapper, who's a chiropractor in Omaha. The entire University of Nebraska medical staff seemed like were over on the other side. They were the people all were against the mask. They were all for it. And they were saying things that were provably not true. And I'm going, what is going on here? And at the end of my little 3 minutes that they made us wait 6 hours to speak. We got 3 minutes each. And I said, anyone who believes in masks at this point are either being paid or being played. And for that, I earned the ire, apparently, of academic medicine, which I don't feel bad about, because they were just telling non-truths. And some ophthalmologist from San Francisco called my office in my little hospital where I was practicing part-time to complain about me. And that was enough to get the CEO I'd never met to terminate my orthopedic contract. This is the kind of thing that went on to doctors trying to tell you the truth. Mm-hmm. And that makes you a rebel, but that's okay. It's, God puts you where you're supposed to be. And so that's actually, I always thought when I finally gave up orthopedics, I would be all depressed because it's kind of so much of my life. And I said, no, I'm not. No, I'm someplace else that's better. So it's fine.
Well, now you can be a rebel with a cause. So,
so now I have a cause. Yeah,
that's your new path. Yeah, that's right. That's right. It's funny because I think back at that time, and I did see there was one doctor that had done a video, and I think it was on YouTube back around that time. And he did come forward, and this was in the early stages when people were, shunned for saying such things, and I remember thinking, wow, that's the truth. Like it resonated for me that it was true.
That's why they didn't want speaking.
Exactly. And then and what was funny is I went back to find that video because I wanted to share it with a friend, couldn't find it. It was just gone after that. And I never did get the jab because I just always felt like there was something about it that didn't seem right. And, I had a lot of people pressuring me, as I'm sure a lot of people did. And I just kept on saying, no, I'm not going to do it, including family, by the way. But I just said, no, I'm not going to do it. And I'm so grateful now at this point that I didn't do that. Yeah.
Yeah. And, people don't realize how many of us, there were a bunch of us, at least 20 of us, that were speaking out pretty early on. And, but you never heard us because everybody, like I was on Outside the Beltway. It was John Frederickson had this, I think he still does have the show. And literally I went on one time. This is when he was just radio before he went on TV. I was on his show one time, and he had been for 10 years putting his shows up on YouTube. That one time I went on, like this was very early in 2020. Boom, down. He was permanently banned from YouTube. I feel bad. I had he became a good friend of mine who was like the drive-by guy. He was the big radio talk show guy in Omaha, Nebraska. And I went on his show, and then he liked it. We were doing every Wednesdays. But again, the University of Nebraska funded a lot of the radio ads, and they didn't like what I was saying. And and rather than he said, no, I'm going to have, they fired him.
Wow.
So, I mean, I had become toxic, and I was a nobody, but what I was saying was something they did not want out. What I was saying in a fairly coherent fashion apparently was too dangerous. That's right. That whatever the truth is, that it's not what they're saying when they do that.
Exactly. But I think that voice is getting louder now across the country. More people are adding to that. So it's harder to censor that many people, right? At this stage. And I feel like it is becoming more of a widely discussed topic, and people are more accepting of it too, in terms of what the truth behind it is. And someday we'll know what the truth is. But I would love if you could show us some of what we talked about at the conference, because like I said, it was eye-opening material. And I think it's something that a lot of people would appreciate hearing about.
Sure. Well, I'll start with this. And this is what my question to myself when I stumbled across this was. I realized what is going on the Senate seal. And I don't remember exactly what brought me to this. It was something, it's something about this. One of these symbols came up, and I started looking into it and realized it was a very ancient symbol. So here we have the United States Senate seal. And what happens is they make these things so our eyes are drawn to the stars and stripes, and we just see, and we don't look any further. We're not paying attention. But, as Manly P. Hall, who was a famous philosopher and lecturer and things, and looking at symbols, he said years ago, when the human race learns to read the language of symbols, a great veil will fall from their eyes, and they will not only learn the truth, but that the truth has been among us all along. Now, I think that's a little bit paraphrased because I can't remember the exact quote, but he's saying it. He did say the human race, and it's very interesting the way he says it, because when you hear him say it, you think he's sounding like he's talking about some other race other than himself, which also is, I think, a clue to what's going on.
Yeah,
but anyway,
definitely.
So when you dissect this thing apart, there's several things. First, on the top is that red hat. Now, they'll claim that's the Liberty cap, but is it really? It turns out that's called the Phrygian cap. Now, the Phrygian cap, it's okay that symbols come down through time. I get that. But this is from 5,000, 4,000 BC, somewhere in that time frame. The Phrygians predated the pharaohs, and in school, we never hear them. We always start at when I was in 6th grade, or whenever we started studying the pharaohs, that was our oldest civilization we ever talked about. And it turns out that they, in fact, were Phrygian. When you look at now we have their DNA, and we realize that all roads lead to Phrygia. That was my talk at the GSIC, because this hat is one of them. And it's not what it says it is, which we'll get into here in a minute. And then the crossed symbols at the bottom, it's a symbol of, it's a bunch of sticks that are wrapped with, they say it's an axis, but it's actually just sticks that are wrapped. And then there's, in some of these, there's a stick there's an axe head on it. But this cross symbolism is, that is a symbol of fascism. Now, why would the United States have the symbol that we associate with fascism on their symbol here? That is my question to myself was, here Mussolini has that in a symbol, in a single axe, single bundle, it's called a fascist. Why would he have the fascist on his hat, and we condemn him for being a fascist? Everybody runs around calling everybody fascist. Where's Antifa when you need them to actually do something about this? Because what you're going to find, and this is also what I think is true. Albert Pike said that the symbol, which has endured from time immemorial, going back to the earliest thinking, that comes nearest to the universal language that we have. And so
Mhm.
symbols tell us things. And this is what I think is important for people to understand, that we have symbols all around us. We've been seeing them for our whole lives, and we haven't been thinking what they meant. Now, some we do. For example, if you see somebody with a cross hanging around their neck, well, if you're familiar with Christianity, the New Testament, you don't have to be told a story about that. You know a lot about that because it's part of it. That little two-part piece of jewelry just, really tells you, it's like a ding that says, oh, and that's that whole history that I learned all my life, for example. One thing symbols do is they tell you something that's in a small little nugget. They tell you a very big long story if you know the story. But the other thing about symbols is they can be used to hide the truth from people that are not initiated. And that's a lot of what we have going on here. So in World War II, we used the Navajo code talkers. And the beauty that they had is they spoke a language that was ancient and proprietary, to the point that nobody in Japan or Germany spoke it. And they didn't have anybody they could train to speak it in the time it would take. So this was an unbreakable code because the language was so obscure. And I would say that's also what we're dealing with in today's world when we look at symbols. And this is my overarching idea, is that when you really look at this, and what I've done is I've traced the symbols, I've used linguistics. They have all these really, they're like GPS only with linguistics, so they can follow language over the world. I've used haplotypes from genetics, and where they've mapped different genomes, and they've actually looked at ancient mummies and the ancient Romans, for example, and then looked at the symbols, how they've come through time. And that's what it shows you. It shows you, for example, that and this is what Herodotus said in 400 BC, that the masses are essentially ruled by an elite class that are all related, and they're not us. The masses have a different origin than these people, and that they may change from place to place. And here's my state seal. It's also eight states of the United States have the Phrygian cap on their seal. Why? This is the, and it doesn't seem to matter about the question. I mean, the color. It's just the question is, why is it there here? And I went back in time, and when we were a territory, we didn't have it. But sometime after, in 1846, when we became a state, we acquired the Phrygian cap. Now, not all states did, though. And it's hard to figure out. Like North Carolina has it. Hawaii has it. New York has it. And we have it, for example. So there's 4 states, none of which have anything really in common. One of them was a territory. One of them was one of the original 13. 2 of them were the original 13. And then Iowa was not an original 13, was not one of the latest, like Hawaii or Alaska. It was not or Puerto Rico or anything else like that. It was an old time territory. So what's it about? It's telling us something which I haven't completely figured out. Okay, so what happened is, when we started seeing when the Phrygian cap showed up somewhere, and somebody mentioned it, I started seeing it, and I realized Phrygian. What's Phrygia? Now, when I heard about the Phrygian cap, the first thing I thought is, oh, they called the cap of the French Revolution the Phrygian cap. I remembered that from studying history years ago. So then I started looking at where Phrygia was and what it was all about. So and this is the classic Phrygian cap from the time of the French Revolution. It's a soft, and keep in mind, to identify it, you have to realize it's not the same color. The Smurfs wear the Phrygian cap.
That's what I was going to say it looks
colors.
like.
Right. And so it's not about the color. It's about this soft cap that has kind of the front some part of it flopping forward, and it's worn in these occasions. Now, here's one of the things I will tell you is the Phrygian cap seems to always pop up when there's evil afoot. So the French Revolution was not all that nice, and they used the guillotine was a symbol of the revolution. Here's, because they chopped off all these people's heads, here's the Phrygian cap sitting on top of the guillotine. So it's kind of like they're demonstrating, even though this was satire, it's satire with a point. And here we have the pro-abortion thing in Washington, D.C. in 2017. Now, again, I wouldn't have necessarily picked up on this, except that they made such a big deal about the hat. there you can find multiple news stories that go on and on about the pussy hat, they called it, and about the significance, the powerful impact. In other words, they're drawing our eyeball. They're drawing the people who know. No, they're drawing the people that would know the message to say, hey, we're doing this, and here's, you know who we are because there's our symbol, kind of thing. And this is where Phrygia is. Phrygia is in ancient Turkey, which was called Anatolia. And if you look right in the middle, it says Phrygia, but Phrygia was actually an empire that expanded from where it is there, like to the left of that one river, all the way over to Thrace, essentially. That was the Phrygian Empire. And it's what's amazing to me is that in this huge Eurasian, continent that we have, why that little place has the symbols all over our world. And I'm going to skip through some of this and stay on the symbolism, but they were the first to coin money. They were the first to have commerce. They were first to do lots of things. If you're a biblical scholar, you might know that area of the world because of the Pergamon altar, which was the seat of Satan. And it was unearthed in the 1800s, and it was rebuilt in Berlin, full-size model. This is the old friezes they put. And that was used as the model for the Nuremberg trials and the Nuremberg rallies, rather. And that was where Hitler stood on that dais. But Albert Speer, the famous architect, he built the Pergamon altar into that rally center as that building. And if you look at it, you can see the Doric columns on the front. And if you want to get even creepier, in 2008, Barack Obama went over to Berlin and visited the Pergamon altar in the museum. And afterwards, I remember sitting with a friend of mine and looking at the DNC convention when he was nominated for running for president the first time. And I remember saying to her, don't you think that's a weird looking backdrop? What is that kind of Romanesque looking background? Well, you can see it. It's the Pergamon altar.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
And then why would you name? It turns out that after World War II, all of medical and scientific publishing is actually owned by the intelligence services. I mean, with rare exception, like the AAPS journal that can't get themselves be listed in PubMed. If you're listed in PubMed, you're owned by probably Springer Verlag or one of the very big presses, and they're owned by the intelligence services. And after World War II, it started here because they combined the German press with the British press, and they hired Robert Maxwell to run it. Now, Robert Maxwell wasn't a journalist. He wasn't a scientist. He was a spy. And he spied for Britain. He spied for the Mossad. He spied for probably the KGB, because he went over one time and met with Brezhnev at Brezhnev's request, and he speaks fluent Russian, so he was able to converse without a translator, and they had a little tete-a-tete, which is not normal in the time when nobody could go to the Soviet Union unless you had special compensation or dispensation. And then we know he's CIA somehow because his daughter is Ghislaine Maxwell, the pedophile consort of pedophile Jeffrey Epstein. I mean,
wow.
Why would they name the Pergamon Press, the seat of Satan, for a medical journal? And I thought to myself, for medical publishing, I thought, well, let's just see what's going on here. What was COVID really all about? I mean, we don't call it Satanism. It's the old religion to them, but it's the old religion is driving this, the old beliefs, the old ways. So, and we even have Phrygian music, which I'll skip over, but it's a dark dystopian music. I don't know if I played it dark. Yeah. So, and
is that what's incorporated, do you feel like, in today's music? Have they kind of worked those tones into it?
Yeah. Well, here, I'll play a little bit of it. Maybe if I can get this to play. I don't know if you can hear that.
Yeah.
It's really dark.
Yeah.
And then the name of it is quite interesting. Set the controls for the heart of the sun. Now, it turns out that, just random facts I've run across in my lifetime, but there's a myth of the Mesoamericans that the world ends when humans go to the sun, when they try to go to the sun. So we have a Phrygian scale, music, Set the Controls for the Heart of the Sun by Pink Floyd.
Yeah.
So again, here is Phrygia. And I'm just going to explain now, right now we're having all this missile, show in Ukraine and Russia, but let me just explain what I think is the reason for all that. And it dates back, Phrygia fell in 800 BC to this group called the Sumerians, not Sumerians, but Cimmerians. So here you have Phrygia, and when we call it conquering a country, you think about it, they didn't come down and necessarily take out everybody. All the people are still there. It's just like when we won World War II, what happened to the German leadership, the elites, right? Well, like the senior member of Hitler's military at the end of the war became the senior military guy of the NATO military committee after the war. He just changed uniforms.
Right.
So I think that's generally what happens, but it also causes people some people leave, before the onslaught, or some people leave during that. So there's a diaspora. And what happened is these Sumerians came down to Phrygia and beat up the elites, I guess, what they could. And some of them fled west, where they became the Lydians, and then the Etruscans, and then the Roman emperors. So the bloodline of the Roman emperors came from Phrygia. The next thing they did is over years from that time, from 800 BC forward, they kind of made a more slow diaspora over to the eastern part of, that's the Black Sea above there. And they went around the Black Sea counterclockwise, and they took over the ruling house of Khazaria. Khazaria before that had been a Mongol-based Hun Slavic conglomerate nation. It was a great big nation. And why it's important to anybody that wanted to get control of the world would be, it was the Silk Road. It was big, big money. So these guys came around and they started exploiting the Silk Road and killing the traders that came down and taking their names. So they became known as the name assumers, but these are Phrygians. And the reason that's important is because that's Ukraine today, is essentially where the Khazarian Empire was. And what we call, and the Cimmerians were the proto-Russians. They were the first people to live on Russian soil. So when Putin was interviewed by, the guy from Fox News, Tucker Carlson.
Yeah.
Tucker Carlson hadn't studied this history, so he was quite taken aback when Putin started his discussion of the history of this whole conflict at 800 AD. Well, it actually, I would say, goes back to 800 BC, but during that period of time, it was all simmering. And again, it's not, the Khazarian nation was a pass-through. So the people that get upset about Khazaria, it's not true, all that, just, it's anti-Semitic because a lot of people came out of there that became the Ashkenazi Jews. It's not about that. It's about a pass-through of these ancient people from Phrygia. They were also the Babylonians. When we hear about Hammurabi and the law code, that started during this Phrygian diaspora, that when they went down into the Middle East, they also assumed titles and roles there, and they brought their law code with them. So whoever Hammurabi was, he got it from the Phrygians. I'm pretty darn sure. I can't completely prove that yet, but that's where we go. But there's a slide I like to show. When you look at
those are people we've seen before.
Yeah, right. And when you look at the ruling class of any country, the big shots of any profession, they're all these people. They may go by different names, but here's an example. If you want to know why Tom Cruise doesn't age and he is like the biggest of the big, it's because, and why he could get married in the Castillo de Orsini is because he is an Orsini. And the Orsini clan are the senior black nobility of Italy. Pepe Orsini is the head of it, and he is a direct descendant of Julius Caesar. So again, when Rome fell, they didn't go away, right? They just took off their togas, put on banker suits, and became these business people. Okay, that's what happens in this whole thing. She can trace her bloodline back to Julia. She's the granddaughter of Julia, the sister of Julius Caesar. And we see the bloodlines today like this. This is what Springhour, whatever his first name is, talks about in the bloodlines of the Illuminati. But the ones that he cites are really kind of the third tier bloodlines. They're these bloodlines. When you go up a couple tiers, then you get into the Habsburgs and the royalty, and then you get into the black nobility, which are really at the top of the top, I think. But
and we probably would never know those people's names, I'm sure, either.
Right. And we would not, on the pyramid of power here, we don't know the people on top because we never see them. We see these guys. And so basically the Hollywood, the politicians, the lower level royals, they let us see them and they do their jobs. And not all of them. So like Bill Clinton, I mean, look, there's Nelson Rockefeller, if you don't think they're related, but Bill Clinton was conceived because his mother married a Clinton after he was born or when she was pregnant. That's not his real name. I mean, he was not a Clinton by blood. But Winifred Rockefeller was the governor of Arkansas when he was conceived. And the story is it was, Nelson came down, visited his brother, the whole thing. But they said that's still just a story because they set these things up. And anybody that doesn't get the Justin Castro thing, I mean, Justin Trudeau and Castro. But why is it Fidel Alejandro Castro? Because Fidel Alejandro refers to the fact that he is the great descendant of Alexander III, the Pope. Wow. He's not just some beatnik that became the president of Cuba because he became a revolutionary, Right. Some rebels have bloodlines. So that's what I'm getting at. So the question is, what about these symbols? This is what got me on this road and what led me to really looking more at the history. Now here's again, their history they taught us is completely wrong. So they will tell you that the fasces came to Rome by the Etruscans. And they make it sound like the Etruscans are different people. Well, it turns out the Etruscans were the Phrygians. When they came over and moved into Italy, they called them Etruscans. And they spoke a language that, again, was so proprietary that it isn't even fully translated to today. Up until the computer age, they had only translated about 60 words. I think they're doing better now. But Etruscan is a weird, and that's one of the signs of the bloodline is they know the old tongue. So it's when they said a virus was spreading around in Wuhan killing people, they weren't lying, but virus in Latin means poison. It doesn't mean a germ. Okay. Well, here's the same kind of thing. So they're claiming the Etruscans brought the fascist symbol to Italy, to the Romans, because that was a symbol of Roman power. But in point of fact, here it is, and it's on a Roman coin with the Phrygian cap above it. So the Phrygians apparently, and I believe they did have the fasces, that was their symbol that they brought forward. And here's this is Mussolini, and and he had his people carry the fasces alongside of him as a symbol, and it symbolized the power of the magistrate of the people. But notice that there's no axe on his fasces. That's really key, because I don't think the axe is modern artwork. I don't think it had an axe on in the days it was really carried and used as a symbol. Now, in the days of the Roman Empire and the Etruscans and Phrygians, they had people that were designated to carry this fasces, and they were called lictors. There were 12 of them, and they were strongly built men, exempted from military service. They received a fixed salary, and they were organized in a corporate structure. And when you met two people on a street, let's say the emperor met just a magistrate, the magistrate's lictors would bow the fasces to the senior guy. So essentially what these things are, the lictors were like, think Jason Statham in The Transporter. He's a paid bodyguard. Okay, these were privately maybe through the government paid bodyguards. It sounds like they're privately paid bodyguards for the senior people, and certain people were allowed to have lictors and carry the fasces, and these are the list. So if you're the dictator, you could have up to 24 of these guys. Everybody else, it's like 12 or below. And if you're just at the bottom, you only get 2 of these guys. But why would you carry something like that just as a symbol? Okay, if that's not a weapon, why are you carrying it to guard these people? And I think that's one of the questions that's come up. Well, I found that my friend Celeste Solom, just randomly, I was researching this and I came across her name, and she's asking what kind of a weapon this was. Because see, if it's an axe, first of all, you would never put the axe head in the middle of the stick bundle. If those are just sticks, why, I get the idea. Sticks together like that, bundled together, are much stronger if you're going to hit somebody like a club than one piece of wood. But why would you add an axe head in the middle? It's not an axe head. That is there for some other reason. And these things are obviously kind of heavy. Look at them. I mean, they're big things back then. The people carrying the fasces are not the people in command. People that do not carry them, that are surrounded by these lictors, they're the ones that carry the imperial seal, essentially. They're the real power behind everything. So here's an interesting, I'm showing you stuff I didn't talk about. This is just,
this is great.
So this is kind of fun. This is, if you remember, in 1913, we adopted the Federal Reserve. These guys signed above an old Canaanite altar in Jekyll Island. They signed the documents that took us down this road to the Federal Reserve, which has been terrible for us ever since, impoverished our nation. It's just been awful. But a couple years after that, they minted in Philadelphia the mercury dime for the first time. Now, I didn't mention this, but Philadelphia was not first labeled a city in Pennsylvania. Philadelphia comes from Phrygia. It was an ancient town in Phrygia. Okay, so it doesn't mean the city of brotherly love. It's from an ancient old religious area near where they had the Pergamon altar. So anyway, they minted this dime. And if you look at the front of the dime, which I've seen my whole life and never paid attention to, I even found this after I was at GSIC. So here's a guy, and he's wearing a Phrygian cap. The reason we know it's a Phrygian cap is because of that weird top knot over the top of his head. So he's got the Phrygian cap, but he also has the wings of Mercury, or Hermes, the messenger of the gods. Okay, that's the front. And the backside, there's the darned fasces. And this one doesn't have an axe. It's just that bundle with something maybe in the middle that's obscured by the vines. So to my mind, what this is telling us, remember, 3 years after we adopted the Fed, that we were sent a Phrygian messenger to America. There was a message brought. It was from Phrygia, and there was a power transfer of the fasces somehow. I think that's what's going on. Now, I can't prove that, but it's interesting that why do we have Abraham Lincoln in the memorial sitting holding two of these fasces? If we're not a fascist nation, why are we holding? So it's not a symbol. It's a symbol of power of something. We are the maybe the lictor countries. Okay, here's France. France has got the fasces on its passport. And here's the point I'm getting to. Here's our Senate chamber. It's not just the Senate seal. Here's the Senate chamber where they meet and they pass laws. And here it is. There's the fasces on both sides of the dais, and their axes are facing the American flag. You just got to ask. So the question is this, so the symbol of fasces is displayed by lictor countries, which makes USA, England, and France at least, and maybe there are more countries. I haven't looked at Germany. I haven't had attempts to research that yet. And Russia, I don't know about modern Russia. I know that the Imperial Russia showed the fasces on the gates of Alexander's summer palace and maybe other places, but I don't know now. But at least United States, England, and France right now, and I'll bet you Australia, are basically, are we just glorified bodyguards? Are we the lictor countries? And the lictors, again, protect whoever holds the imperium, the power to command. That protected country does not display the fasces, I'm going to bet. And so if that's true, who does not display the fasces? Well, I looked at the Vatican. The Vatican doesn't display it until that I can find. I can't find evidence of it in the Vatican until Pope Francis. And you know the symbol, the what do they call it? The in the royal crest, I guess it's the royal crest of the houses. Well, the royal crest essentially of the Vatican is that cross keys. They have the papal hat. They have the cross keys. That's who holds the key to the Vatican, right? Who holds the key? Well, anyway, the keys up until Pope Francis were all a solid column, but now it's the fascist column. It's now the bundle of sticks. I don't think I think that's significant. I don't think that's by accident.
Of
so
course,
now maybe it has been because it now is a lictor country as well. It's not in command anymore. I don't know. That's what we ought to be looking at.
Interesting.
So,
yeah. And nobody is even paying attention to these things, I'm sure.
Yeah. So that's really what I've been doing. And there's so much symbolism, even the e pluribus unum that we have on the back of that coin and that we have all over our stuff, that dates back to the Phrygian era. This whole idea of and they changed the names of the gods so you can't follow out. But it's all the same. I mean, if you want Nimrod, Gilgamesh, Tammuz, they're all the same people. But the story of this god Nimrod is that he was, after the flood, he was chopped up because he was an abomination of God. He was chopped up into 14 pieces, and he was scattered. Those pieces were scattered around the world so that they couldn't be reassembled. But his wife, Semiramis, and again, you could put the older gods' names to this. This passes through a long period of time. She found 13 of the 14 pieces, and she put them together, and through black magic was able to recreate the one piece missing, which was the penis. Okay. And
there's a lot of jokes we could make about that.
Well, and there's a reason that that's an important point, is that she recreated that and was able to have children then by Nimrod. And that generative principle is a huge thing in the ancient pagan religion. So that story is a big deal. Okay, there's Washington Memorial. All of these obelisks, the one sitting in front of the Vatican, the one in, see the three cardinal cities, the Vatican, the city of London has one, and we have one. It's the Washington Monument. Now, by the way, I think Washington was a good guy. I don't think he was a bad guy, but he was royal bloodline. He was one of these bloodlines, and he turned against them to try and separate out America. It's what I think happened. I think he really tried to do the right thing. Yes, he was a Mason, but he warned us against the illuminated masonry. So he was a real Mason. Okay. Anyway, the penis of Nimrod is these obelisks. Now, this is here's John Podesta, and he's at an art show by Marina Abramovich, who did the spirit cooking. And I don't care about that. I'm just showing you that's where he did this picture. But apparently, so he's holding up his hand, the 14 and the fish. Now, I didn't tell you one of the parts of the story. The story goes that the penis of Nimrod was eaten by a fish. Okay. And that the old pagan religion worships the generative principle, the penis in this whole story. And so when he's putting his hands up there with his 14 and the fish, what he's saying is, it's been accomplished, or he's saying something like that about this, because the 14 pieces are now together. He's saying the 14 are one. And from that concept comes e pluribus unum, from the many one.
Wow.
I'm telling you, every time you turn around,
wow.
I can't research any one part of this without finding something else. It's so crazy.
Right.
And I will just tell you about the Capitol. I found this looking about the symbolism of the United States Capitol. And when I started doing that, this whole issue of who stands on the Capitol and all that, I started going back and trying to find the pictures of the old Capitol. And what I found is it doesn't make sense in any timeline. Some pictures earlier have a dome when they say it hadn't been built yet. Other pictures later have no dome. There's two different Washington monuments. There's a shorter one with a base around it that's a building, and then there's a tall one, and they claim it was built. There's a picture of the Capitol just around the time of the Civil War, just before the Civil War, and there's no roads or nothing around it. It's like it's completely out in space, like just dirt around it. Now, wait a minute. How could that be? I've seen, this is where we get into the whole, what is our timeline? What is the issue with these old buildings that we call them Victorian, but they're obviously not. They're all Romanesque. They've got these domes, and they're much older than what we're being told. I mean, people have looked at the marble steps in some of these buildings and compared it to the marble steps in Rome, where we claim those buildings are thousands of years old, and they're similar. How long does it take to erode marble? And it turns out a very long time, longer than what could have happened in our nation's capital. I have in my little town, the county courthouse in my little Harrison County. So it's 14,000 people in the county. My great grandfather homesteaded this county in 1871 with a covered wagon and a cow maybe, or an ox or something. They didn't have anything. My grandfather was a blacksmith, and in 1910 he had no money to put together. He was just a young lad starting out, and yet they claim that they built this beautiful building, this beautiful domed building with Italian marble columns and all this fabulous stuff. It can't have happened that way. I'm actually going to, he has a diary he kept. I'm going to try and find if he talks about that
would be
in his
great.
diary. Yeah. But I recently there's come out that, and Iowa is unusual because it has 99 counties, fairly equally spaced around a big central capital that all have these Tartarian-like domed stone buildings with doors that are too tall for normal people, with ancient artwork built into the floors and all this stuff. I mean, it's not, you can't tell me this was built in 1910. First of all, as the second poorest county in Iowa, traditionally, they couldn't have afforded it. These guys didn't even have much. I mean, they're lucky to have dirt roads back then. It was really primitive. And to think that they built this, there's just no way. And if you think of our language, we call it a foundation when the bottom of the building, like foundation. I can't help but say that. And so I found recently pictures of the Iowa Capitol and the Montana Capitol, again, like the national capital. Here they are. They wouldn't have, if you didn't have a state, you wouldn't have built a capital. Now, we were made a state in 1846, and the capital was Des Moines, Iowa, theoretically. Why would you build a building completely out in the plains with all you can see from a long ways around is just mud? And yet we see that capital in that setting, and same the Montana Capitol.
Wow.
So I think what we're dealing with is we've been so, this is why I was so happy to go to the Galactic Spiritual Informers Conference, because, usually I go to conferences and they don't add to my worldview too much. I may learn a few things, but they don't really change. But that one changed my view enough to fit saying this does not make sense in the timeline and the history of our country that goes along. And another interesting thing, because I read Russian, I don't speak it, but I read it, and I speak enough to figure this out when they're saying it. I heard a Russian, or I read this article by this guy, and he was talking about the Tartarian Empire having come out. There's still a little place called Tartary in Russia. If you notice how big Russia still is, the largest landmass of anything, it apparently is the remnant of what was the Tartarian Empire. Those domed, the Moscow, Red Square domed buildings, and their old domed churches all over the place, and all these domed buildings. Well, he was saying that this guy's point was, when the Americans, what they don't realize is that when our civilization spread around the whole world, that the names that you have for your Native Americans and for your states, they came from us. And I can't remember, I'm going to have to go back. It's been a long time, so I looked at that. I'm going to have to go back and look at that again. But one of the states he mentioned was Nebraska. Now, the history of Nebraska was it was the largest territory that hadn't been made into a state. It went from Nebraska, I think, over to Washington State. It was a huge territory at the time. And according to this guy, this Russian guy, he said that was where, when the Tartarian Empire existed, that was where the indigenous peoples lived. And they were not us. They were another ethnic group. And so we called that the area of not our brother. And in Russian, that would be net bratska. I read that and I said, oh my God. Nebraska.
That's amazing.
So
Nebraska.
Yeah, so we are not living in the world as we thought it. Now, what I have a hard time with is my ancestors. I mean, I do have the bloodline. I'm in all fairness. I am the descendant of Prussian royalty on my mother's side. It comes through the X chromosome, and there are no men that got in the way. So just by accident, they married into they married. It was all women coming down the branch. So I think the Russians have information and knowledge that they are keeping close to their breasts. Okay, they've got them, and they've got deep vaults somewhere, and that's part of this. I think what's been happening, and it's not as far back as I would think, but I know what it was. That my problem with when this happened. When did the world, whoever built those great buildings, when did Great Tartary get destroyed? That's really the question. Is it really 1,000 years ago? Is it 200 years ago? Why was it so primitive in America, apparently fairly recently? What were the orphan trains about? That's what we were talking about on that other video when we were talking about the World's Fairs. What were they really about? You don't tell me those are temporary buildings. They were still tearing down. They've been purposely staging wars and these fires. Like the year of there was a year where fires took down all these different cities that had these old buildings, like the Chicago fire. So these people that rule our world now, and I use people somewhat loosely, the people that rule our world now are actually they probably have more recent memory of what's going on here. They tend to live, you notice the Rockefellers and Mitch McConnell and all these people, they live into their hundreds and 90s easily. Right. We don't so much, right? They're purposely damaging us and not themselves, probably through the vaccine program and various other things. You notice that Brussels doesn't fluoridate their water, and they don't have 5G. And I'm sure they use chlorine dioxide as their water treatment program. I mean, you don't want to know what's going on. Look at how they live. But there's a timeline problem. So my grandfather, again, I knew my grandfather. He was born in 1882. I knew him well. So he did not mention anything to me that would have given any hint that he knew about any of this going on. Now, the question is, how did they lie about it, to those people? How would they not know? And his father, that he knew absolutely, he wasn't, my grandfather was not some made up person. So that gives me family memory back into the 1850s, 1860s. I don't understand how when it happened. Is it were the Napoleonic Wars when it happened? That what we think of as the Napoleonic War was all a fraud. That was when they took down the world and made it, depopulated, but left these great buildings.
But it could be just one of the best kept secrets too. Do you feel like that's possible, that there are generations that just were kept in the dark from these things?
Well, that's what I'm saying, but I don't know. It has to be. Some people think it happened during the 1800s. I think it's got to be before. It's got to be. It may not be 1776. It may be in to me, the best time frame for this would be the Napoleonic Wars, because otherwise my father and my grandfather, they would have talked about it. They would have known. Yeah. Somebody would have known. So that's really the question I have. That's, and really, there's a mind-blowing book that I just discovered, and I got this from the Americans in Action guys. They know about all this stuff. AmericansInAction.info. They talk to you about the false legal system that we inherited from the Phrygians. They didn't know it was from the Phrygians, but they knew what it was. It was we talk about escaping Babylon, but Babylon really is probably really the Phrygians. I could say, they had a book, and it's called 0%. And if you want a mind-blowing book, I recommend that to people. What it is, it talks about lots of different things, but this guy shows, he went to the archives of, for example, of the American archives and the British archives and things. And here's a mind blower. He shows a picture of King George III as a black person, or mulatto. He's like a mixed race person. He's what they call a Moor. And what his point is that America was actually under the Sultan of Morocco. This is a totally different history than what we were. And that Abraham Lincoln, it looks like he delivered his first inaugural speech in Arabic. What the heck? The translation, and it was mistranslated with pronouns that came, and that makes sense if the original was in Arabic. And he said, by the way, that first inaugural speech, again, a lot of the history we've been told can't be right. This idea about him, what he said later, what they claim he said later about slavery, he says in his first inaugural speech, I am not going to go after the slavery issue. That's not my issue. He says that several ways in that speech. Now, if that's true, then why do we come down with a history that the Civil War started before Lincoln, when they knew he was coming in and they knew what he was going to do? That isn't what he said. I just don't know what to think. But it makes it kind of, was the Civil War real? I think it had to, it had to be. I think we have two. That's too recent to have faked. But was it what we thought it was? You know, when people don't have long-term memory, they don't have. When we find the books, actually, and when we find some of these old books, they're not telling us what what we are being told by people that are in an oral tradition, like in our public schools, where they've rewritten the books. They claim they've rewritten this history, but see, as the books get rewritten, they get changed.
Right.
So I would say we can't trust anything at this point.
I mean, it's the same with modern day media. We're not getting the full story of what's happening overseas either. And it's not like we're there to on the, boots on the ground to see what's happening. So they can put anything on television and we have no choice but to believe that.
That is so true. And that is why that's why we aren't as children from the time we're in kindergarten taught another language. They don't want that. We have been isolated. You know, the joke about, what do you call, in Europe, what do you call somebody that's trilingual, and what do you call somebody that's or what do you call somebody in Europe that speaks 3 languages trilingual? What do you call somebody that's bilingual or speaks 2 as bilingual? What do you call somebody that speaks 1? An American. That's the joke. And that is true.
Yeah, it's true.
And, when I started reading Telegram is when I caught on to some of what's going on here, because I could find, that's when I started looking in the Russian. I knew right away in COVID to look at the Russian sites, because I'd been reading Telegram in the Russian sites before that. And I started looking and now on computer to find bigger stuff. Well, if you read what they're talking about, you will find, because you get the chats, you get people that are not reporters. They're just chatting in their language, and they're not obviously being told what we're being told. And the other interesting thing is that, I noticed that early on when I was reading Telegram, the first thing that happened to me, you think Telegram isn't being censored. The first thing that happened to me was, after reading Russian, the RT in English for maybe a year, suddenly it said, this can't be displayed on your device. This can, because of community guidelines, this can no longer be displayed on your device. I thought, well, that's weird. So then I thought, I wonder if I could read it in Russian. And that's when I started reading Russian again. It started very slow and painfully, but because I'd been a long time out of college. But anyway, I started reading it in Russian. And then 6 months later, suddenly that was taken away. So then I went to another one, like not too long ago, a year ago, I looked for Secret Sonata. He's obviously Russian, but writing a lot of stuff there. So it's kind of bilingual. That one has some Russian, some English in it. And then, boom, that one, same thing. That one went away. And then what did I just lose like a month ago? It's like more rapidly I'm losing things. And the key point is, but I can walk across the street to my neighbor who has, just working a job, not having anything to do with things like I do. And I said, using your phone, can you get on Telegram? Yes. Okay. I want you to see if you can go to this site. He can get to all those sites. So you see,
they're creating a divide.
So this censorship is not like Big Brother in 1984, where he's broadcasting to the world. This censorship is individualized to you.
Interesting.
So I'm being blocked from reading things that my neighbor is not. That's really kind of creepy. Now, the next point of that is, if you flip that around, is my weird world view now, because I've been fed a bunch of false information that they want me to have, that's consistent, because they can make this false stuff consistent on the internet. That's what we don't know. That's why it's so hard to sort through. We are in a super information war, and we are the victims of this.
Right. And that's why it's so important to do the research, right? You have to look in multiple places too. It's not like you can just go to one source and feel like you got the full story. You really have to cross-reference across a number of different credible sources, which, I'm amazed that you're able to come up with as much as you did. Have you just been going down rabbit holes researching this to pull all of this together?
When I find something, like I bought a book. So one of the things, like on the capitals, the history of the United States Capitol, I saw a book. It was called The Rulers of Evil. And somebody had mentioned about this book on the internet. And I just said, well, that sounds like something I need to read. So I go to Amazon, and the book, it's a hardback book. It's anything special, just a standard hardback book, $240. But I thought it was important enough that I bought the book. I mean, I don't usually do that, but I bought this book. Now, if you go on Amazon, last time I looked, it was $640 for a used copy.
Wow.
That's the other way they're censoring us.
Amazing.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
once I get on a particular thing, it's like COVID. When I started researching COVID, one thing led me to another. So the PCR test led me to studying genetics to figure out how is this being done, and finding out they were actually testing us to our own genome, not to any virus. Okay. That's what I discovered. And that's a big shocker. So then when you start doing that, you go and look at other things, and you start learning that this is when I came to the agreement, after listening to Andy Kaufman and Thomas Cowan explain why the research on virus is fraudulent. I went down that, and I redid that. I kind of restudied what they studied a little bit so I could make sure they were right. I check everybody's work now. But then I realized, okay, that's so technical, it's hard to explain to people that can't believe there are no viruses. It was hard for me. I'd been in medicine 45 years. I said, are you kidding me? I can believe so many things. I can't, where did that go? But it's right. There are no viruses like we've been led to believe. It's other things. They're poisoning us and convincing us it's an airborne infectious disease. It's a great anti-human agenda. It's just not true. But what I did is then what my particular thing, and I told Andy about this later, I said, do you know who John Franklin Enders is? Let me tell you. And he said, no. I said, well, this is how they did it. This is who did it. Not the technical stuff scientifically like you go over, but this is I decided to personalize this and find out, how did they lie to us? And what you find is, no matter where you go, you find the same people. So here's the COVID lie about virus that goes back into the actually it doesn't go back much further than 1980s. In our medical texts. Okay. Before that, when you looked up infectious disease, they didn't talk about virus, they talked about parasites. But as you go back and find out, how did we come to the virus thing? It started with a guy, John Franklin Enders, who theoretically went to Yale in 1916, and he was a very rich scion of some big money East Coast guy, because he was a member of the Scroll and Key Society, not the Skull and Bones. Apparently Skull and Bones that we all know about. That one is for those lesser lights like John Kerry and George Bush, right? That's the little pipsqueaks. But the big guys' kids go to the big Illuminati kids. They go to the Scroll and Key Society. Apparently, that's the way it works. So anyway, and there's actually a wolf's head, which I don't know what they are and how they work, but there are three societies, big societies in Yale. So and then it said on the website of when he got the Nobel Prize, you're supposed to have the biography of the guy. I don't believe my son actually literally called them, because he can't believe mom's right and this is this kind of fraud. So he literally called them, and they said, oh, well, that was apparently a mistake and we'll change it. We got that from some other text. Well, see, that's an excuse. But the story went, when I first looked at this, they had on their website of the Nobel Laureate Peace Prize website that John F. Enders had left Yale in 1917 to go train as a pilot for World War I, with the rank of ensign in the Air Force. Now, if anybody knows anything about the military, there was no Air Force in World War I, and there were no ensigns in the Air Force ever. So that just sounded to me like a Hollywood script that had bad tech support. So then I looked up, again, this is how you go down the rabbit hole. So then I looked up the rest of his credentials, because it's kind of weird that this guy leaves Yale, goes off to fight in World War I, comes back, then graduates in 1921, and then becomes a real estate salesman. But suddenly in 1930, he's got a PhD in bacteriology and immunology from Harvard. Now, that, when I finally got to that point, and even Wikipedia, when I first started doing this, again, they change as they hear we've gotten the story out. They change what they've got on the internet. So I don't know what it is now. But when I first went to Wikipedia, it didn't even tell what his PhD was in. It just called him the father of modern vaccines. But when I finally, again, I went back to the Nobel site, says he's bacteriology, immunology. I looked that up, and I thought that was odd, because when I was training in Rochester, New York, the first immunology degree they hadn't granted one in 1976 when I was a freshman student. That was, my classmate was an MD PhD student getting one of the very first ones in immunology. So it turns out that this guy that claimed to get an immunology PhD in 1930, Harvard didn't give one out till 1974.
Wow.
Again,
unbelievable.
So yeah, these people are frauds. I'm doing a whole series on these frauds, like Einstein's a fraud, I think. And I believe that you can't, again, I can find, what's his name? A very famous physicist from Caltech, Feynman, Richard Feynman, who wrote a beautiful 3-volume on physics. I have, he you can see pictures of him in the 1950s and 60s, and he would go to a blackboard and just do a spontaneous talk. He didn't have notes. He's doing a physics lecture, and in fact, I saw him do one literally on relativity. Well, but you'll never see Einstein do that. Now, they lived at the same time. Einstein was alive in the 50s. He was alive in the 40s, in the age of movies. Now, Feynman participated in the Manhattan Project as a physicist. What did Einstein do? Oh, he rewrote political tracts. And when I did find a little blurb of him talking, like he was going to do a lecture, they don't show you his actually lecturing. They show him with a bunch of guys, and like I showed that picture of the guys in the fancy, like my dad used to have one, a wool overcoat in the winter, all with the hats, and we're walking into someplace at Yale or someplace, maybe it was Princeton. I think it was Princeton, and Einstein gets stopped by the news, and they do what looks like a spontaneous little interview, but he's actually reading from a piece of paper about his research, his famous, E equals MC squared. And he stumbles over E equals MC squared. Even though English isn't his first language, I get that, but this is his big deal. He's been in America for a long time.
His baby.
This is his baby. He shouldn't be doing.
Yeah.
And so my next one is Charles Darwin, which is even more unbelievable. You won't believe Charles Darwin.
Wow. You have done your homework. This is incredible.
Yeah, I could have. My dad had 3 doctorate degrees before he got disgusted with academia, and I said, I could have been a professional student, but I'm doing this. So that's why I'm saying it was.
Well, you sort of are. I mean, you're kind of going back to school by doing all this research and studying, and it's incredible. Yeah. And I think, social media is the game changer here, right? It's allowing people to really go down these rabbit holes and kind of cross-reference things, which, but we still need the people to do the work. And that's what I think is so incredible about you. And that's what I appreciate that you've done for us, that you're bringing this to us. Because, I can only imagine the amount of time and effort it's taken to pull all of this information together. And what's so amazing is you have also a whole wealth of knowledge on the medical side, of course. That's what your profession has been. And at some point, I would love to talk to you more about that too, because I know you did bring up a few subjects during the conference in regards to what your thoughts were about autism and what we can do to help with that. I think there's a lot of people that would benefit from that information.
Absolutely.
And I think you definitely have a lot to offer when it comes to that. So I definitely would love to talk with you again, if that's okay. And we can maybe share more information with the audience. But I think everyone's mind is blown right now with all the information that you just shared today. So we have to let everyone digest. But I want to say thank you so much, Dr. Merritt. This is just incredible. You are just amazing with this information, and so brave, by the way, to bring this information forward. It's not an easy time to do that. It can be kind of scary to talk about some of these things because there's so many people that are coming out against this information that they want to keep it suppressed. Yeah. So thank you so much for bringing this to us and just sharing your knowledge with us. We appreciate that. We appreciate your time and all of the effort and energy you brought to us. So thank you so, so much.
Well, thank you. Thanks so much.